the very beginnings in recent history of the meditation or Kammatthana tradition in northeast Thailand began with Ajahn Puridatta. He lived he was born at the end of last century, died at the end of the 40s, I think 1949. And of the teachers in northeast Thailand, he's the most famous, and the one who began the lineage, which Ajahn Chah, our teacher, was he took on subsequently. He came after Ajahn. He lived with Ajahn for a short time and carried on the line of teaching from Ajahn. Luang Por Man, practicing in those days, many years ago, had to deal with a lot of difficulty and hardship in finding the requisites, finding support for his practice, and with the physical conditions in northeast Thailand. He lived in remote places, on mountains, in deep forest, but because his practice was so pure and successful, he very quickly became famous within the circle of monks who were interested in meditation, particularly in meditation, and quickly the group of monks who became his followers expanded to became a large number. One amongst those was Ajahn Chah, and having become inspired to practice with Ajahn following his style of practice, the Kammatthana style, the meditation style, he went to live with Ajahn Ginari, who was one of the first generation disciples of Ajahn. And Ajahn Ginari was, after Ajahn, the Ajahn who Ajahn Chah looked upon as his teacher. Practicing with Ajahn Ginari, Ajahn Chah practiced meditation till he developed very deep samadhi and profound peace of mind. And once he felt stable enough in his meditation practice, he then started going off wandering, either alone or with small groups of monks, around the forests of northeast and central Thailand, often seeking out very lonely, desolate places where he could practice meditation without being disturbed, but also these places would be places where he would be forced to test his own peace of mind. Often he'd stay in cremation grounds where people and the local villagers would burn corpses or even leave the corpses of the dead villagers just lying in the cremation ground, gradually rotting away. And for Thais, this would be perhaps the most scary place on earth, because the fear of ghosts amongst Thais is very strong, perhaps stronger than Westerners. And it's the tradition of meditation monks to go and stay in such places to confront the fear that they have in their minds. We all have fear, and it's a way of testing their own meditation. And he, briefly you could say, practicing in this way, confronting his own fear of death, many times, he actually got to the point where he went beyond any kind of fear, got beyond all kind of fear. In later years, Ajahn Chah would tell his disciples that it was practicing like this, going through all sorts of difficulties and hardship, and staying in lonely places, fearful places, having meditated with corpses, stayed in forests where there were dangerous animals such as tigers around. He said the result of this was that he gained the Dhamma, and he would impart some of that Dhamma, try to impart as much of that Dhamma as he could to his disciples in later years. There was also another Ajahn, a teacher of Ajahn Chah. His name was Ajahn Tongrat, who Ajahn Chah gained a lot from, and would recount in later years some of the stories and teachings he received from Ajahn Tongrat. His style was that similar to a Zen teacher. He wouldn't give long discourses and explanations of the Dhamma. He'd give shorter teachings which were perhaps applicable in certain situations. Ajahn Tongrat was also a disciple of Ajahn Mun, and one time when he was living, in his early years, living with Ajahn Mun, Ajahn Mun would give the teaching to all of his monks that they should try to eat little, sleep little, and meditate a lot. And Ajahn Tongrat, taking this teaching to heart, went on a 15-day fast. And at the end of the fast, it was the Patimokkha day, the day when all the monks come together for the recitation of the discipline. And during the meeting of the recitation of the discipline, when all the monks were sitting together in silence, very formally, he suddenly took off his jiwan, his monk's robes, and he said, "Ajahn Mun, you taught us to eat little. Well, here I am, I'm about to die, I haven't had any food for 15 days. Ajahn Mun answered that he taught the monks to eat little, but he didn't teach them to not eat anything at all. He said, you have to contemplate my teachings, understand what I mean. The idea is to find the right amount of food, not just to stop eating altogether." There was once an old monk living with Ajahn Tongrat, who, having ordained in life when he was older, found it difficult to do the training in the same way as younger, stronger monks would. He found it difficult to learn the chanting and learn the ropes of the bhikkhu life. But Ajahn Tongrat found a way to teach him. There was one day they were walking, they saw a tree stump in a field, and he said to the old monk that he should make his mind as firm as the heartwood of the tree stump. And he could see the heartwood showing through. This older monk took that teaching away with him and practiced it. Ajahn Tongrat had elaborated to make your mind firm as the heartwood inside the crinkly old bark, means that you should make your mind as firm as you can as you experience sense objects with your ayatana. That's the sense bases, the internal sense bases, the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, and the external sense bases, forms, sounds, smells, tastes, body sensations and thoughts. As you experience all these, you should make your mind as firm, keep it in the middle, not get caught into liking, disliking. And the old monk took this simple teaching away and practiced very diligently with it, even though he couldn't necessarily do some of the external aspects of the monk's life. He wasn't very good at it because he was old, but this very simple teaching, he took it to heart and obtained very good results with it. Another story of Ajahn Tongrat was there was a place where the villagers didn't know much about monks. They wouldn't offer food to monks when they were on alms round. And Ajahn Tongrat went there and he stood in the village and he just kept standing there until in the end the villagers realised what was going on and they came out and brought food to him. He didn't actually, the food he obtained, he didn't actually eat it himself, he gave it away. Someone asked him why he did this. He said he was teaching the villagers to practice dana, generosity, to practice giving up attachment to their food. It's another little teaching of Ajahn Tongrat. Ajahn Tongrat, Ajahn Ginari, these were Ajahn Chahs' first two, after Ajahn Mun, were his first two teachers. He spent most of his time with in his early years, and are also walking around on walking tour, or what we call tudong. And then after a length of time, I can't remember, I think it was his 15th reigns, he came back to his home village, which is where the forest of Ba Pong is, and that's where he set up. He was invited by his relatives to set up there permanently, so he set up in what was originally a very big forest still with wild animals in it, which is now known as Wat Pa Pong, the monastery, his monastery. In the early years at Wat Pa Pong, malaria was very bad. Most of the monks got it, and it was in those days there wasn't so much medicine, so it was potentially very dangerous. You could die easily. So Ajahn Chah told the monks that if you've got malaria, you have to come out of your hut, come out and meet with the Sangha, so that we know what's going on, we know that you've got malaria. The tendency is if you're ill, you just want to lie in your hut and keep quiet, but he made it a rule that you actually have to if you're ill, you actually have to come out of your hut so that other people know that you're ill. In those days, northeast Thailand was very poor, and food, you didn't get a lot on alms round, monks didn't get a lot on alms round. Might just get a few bananas, and it wasn't unknown occasionally they wouldn't just eat the fruit of the banana, they'd eat the banana peel as well. The reason that the monks put up with the hardship was because they had gone there to practice out of faith in the religion, and in particular in Luang Por Chah, Ajahn Chah, as an enlightened teacher. And their aim was to practice meditation. They were interested in seeking the highest fruits from the religion, so they were prepared to put up with all that hardship. The group of monks who were living with Ajahn Chah gradually grew in number, and he'd constantly be encouraging them to practice as hard as they could. One time he said, it was on the 25th anniversary of the monastery, of establishing the monastery, that if just one monk in the group found enlightenment, then the monastery would be it was worth building the monastery and all the practice and hardship that people had gone through. He would usually lead meditation in the evenings. He'd lead the monks and the local people to practice meditation 6 o'clock in the evening, and then do evening chanting. Though in the last couple of years when he was ill, he had to stop that. He didn't have the strength to do that anymore. In the first period up to while he was still strong in teaching, his various disciples when they were established in the practice, they'd tend to go off and set up branch monasteries. And in the first period there was 19 branch monasteries. And that tradition of his disciples moving off, going on walking tours on Tudong, or going to visit different Buddhist groups of Buddhists around both northeast Thailand and even further afield has continued. The number of branch monasteries has continued to grow to the present day. This is just a brief history of the practice of Ajahn Chah and Wat Nong Bap Hong. If we get the chance in the next few days, I'll give you some more about the history, about Ajahn Chah's practice, but for tonight I'll just give you this much. If anybody has any questions, feel free.
One thing mentioned that if one of the monks get enlightened in the temple, that they will be very happy. How could one know? Would he declare that he has attained enlightenment, or is there any signs to recognize that fact?
His actual words, he'd speak quite generally, say if it would be good if one or even many monks, the way of saying it is like straightened out their views, so their views were in line with the Dhamma. But he would never actually say, this monk has attained Dhamma at this level or that level. He would never talk quite precisely like that. He'd speak more generally. There was one monk at Wat Bap Hong. There was a group of monks talking about this subject, about who might be enlightened and which monk was at which level. And one monk had a very strong feeling in his mind that he felt it was almost as if Ajahn Chah was speaking in his head. And the words he heard were like, one disciple of the Buddha doesn't how would you say, doesn't tell, or doesn't try and tell where another disciple of the Buddha is at, what level he's at. So it's inappropriate to look around at the other people practicing and try and tell which person is at what level.
One thing, what would be the prerequisites of those monks who leave the monastery to open up their own monasteries?
It's part of the monk's discipline, the Vinaya, that you have to stay with your teacher for the first 5 years. But once you've practiced for 5 years, then according to the Vinaya, you're actually free to go off on your own, say wandering, going to different places. And when monks left Ajahn Chah, he didn't tell anybody to go and build a monastery or start a monastery. His words would always be to the effect, go and meditate. And usually what would happen was monks would go off moving around without any place in mind necessarily. But then as they'd moved off to different villages, different forests, then along the way they might meet a group. Usually, say, a village would invite a monk to stay on, and a monastery would sort of happen by itself. They didn't actually go off with a specific intention to build a monastery. Ajahn Anan gave his own example when he left Ajahn Chah the first time. There was a group of people on the edge of Bangkok, on a province right next to Bangkok, Pathum Thani, where they had invited monks to go, and he went with another monk to stay there. But Ajahn Chah didn't tell them to go and build a monastery, but he just said go and meditate. And now after many years the monastery, there is a monastery there, it's well established, but that wasn't their original intention. And it says in the early years at that place where he was staying on the edge of Bangkok, it wasn't a sure thing that they would actually build the monastery there. He gave the example, there was one year there was very bad flooding, so when the floods came they put the Buddha Rupa in a cupboard, locked it up, and they went off on walking tour. There's someone else. Do you have a question? Sorry, I didn't hear.
Why a person has fear, and how do we overcome fear?
And when Ajahn Chah was practicing in his early years, and he'd go to these places like the cremation ground, he'd have the most extreme fear, maybe stay awake all night through fear, and he'd be sitting in his mosquito net. So monks in Thailand, they have an umbrella with a mosquito net, and he'd just have his robes and he'd have his alms bowl, and he was so afraid he'd take his alms bowl to be a friend. He'd say almost like hug his alms bowl out of fear and nothing else to depend on. And the way he contemplated was to ask himself in his mind, well, what am I afraid of? And the answer would be, well, death. So then he'd answer, well, where can I go to get away from death? And the answer is, there's nowhere, because wherever you go, you're going to die one day. There's no place that you can't get away from death. And contemplating like this, in the end he felt there was some part of his mind that completely sort of left his mind, and he completely went beyond fear, just contemplating like this back and forth. The fear completely left him. And fear, what fear is it's because you're attached or you love your body very deeply. So any threat to the body or anything that you think is going to threaten you or harm you brings up fear. So if you don't attach to the body, then you won't have fear. From Ajahn Anan's own experience, when he first ordained, he was in Ajahn Chah's monastery. Out at the back of the monastery they had a cremation ground, very sort of dark, eerie place, and every time he walked on alms round, he'd walk past this place and he'd notice he had a sense of fear, dislike for that place. In those days there was no electricity or anything around, it was very sort of quiet and scary place. His first rains, he'd walk past this cremation ground every day for a couple of months, noticing how he's afraid of it. So after a while he decided that if his meditation was going to be of any real value to him, then he should test himself out. And so one night he took his robes and went into the cremation ground. He says when you go to a place where you have fear, in the beginning all you can do is rely on your endurance, patience and endurance as the fear comes up. But if you have endurance, then you can use that and work with the fear, contemplate the fear. By chance, Ajahn Chah, one of his habits was to walk around the monastery late at night, just checking on things. And that night he was walking around, and he came up to Ajahn, where Ajahn Anan, a newly ordained Ajahn Anan, was sitting meditation. Probably had the thought to give a bit of encouragement to the new monk who was fighting with fear. And Ajahn Anan carried on practicing in the same way, going off to, when he had the chance, he might go off to a cremation ground where there were dead bodies or the remains of dead bodies around. He might even, there was one time he took a skull from as a skeleton on the ground. He took the skull and put it on a post, and then practice walking meditation, walking Jongkrom back and forth next to the skull, just to keep contemplating fear. He'd practice maintaining his meditation, maintaining his ability to enter samadhi, and then when he came out of samadhi, when his mind was peaceful, then he'd contemplate exactly what fear was, and looking around, at a skeleton, looking at bones, he'd see that the bones were just bones. Fear was something that he'd created in his own mind. There was no real substance, essence to the fear. It was just something he'd created in his mind through thinking. What he was afraid of, the bones were just bones. Right.
And then giving the noble friend making that very important. But then again we go on and hear that in practicing to practice in isolation, to be alone, go off to cemeteries, graveyards, and that we, and also again it says in other parts it describes the practice as this is one feather long body, isolating it even further. And these thoughts are coming up in the mind as we talk about the way the Dharma's practice. And if I may ramble on a bit, and also that to practice like to be the hippopotamus alone. There are circumstances like that. But I still seem to like and think it's very poignant when the Buddha has said that the practice, the noble friend, is all of the practice. Then it's in relating to Sangha, like people, when he said that the Sangha is dependent on the relating to support the Sangha, and the Sangha needs when people. So again I talk about this relationship, this friendship, and yet it seems like in the practice one has to be alone, and yet we talk about meditating alone, going off to Kanikoyan, staying alone, practicing alone, being alone, spending with friends, and not as isolating as that.
Buddhism, the Buddha, in the beginning, the Buddha practice became enlightened and started teaching what we call Buddhism, and the Sangha, or the Arya Sangha, arose because the Buddha was teaching the way to enlightenment. So in the very beginning, the Buddha was the ultimate or the complete Kalyanamitta, because all the disciples who became enlightened were totally dependent on the Buddha and his teachings. If there hadn't been a Buddha, nobody would have become enlightened. And so he is like the original Kalyanamitta. And that aspect of the Buddha and teaching his disciples until they became enlightened, and disciples teaching disciples, that is one important aspect of Kalyanamitta. Another aspect of it is the teachings or the Dhamma is also the Kalyanamitta, because we have to depend on, to practice the Dhamma, we have to depend on the teachings. We have to think about them, contemplate them, and bring them into our hearts. So in that sense, although sometimes the practice seems to be kind of lonely, or we're practicing in isolation, what we're doing is bringing the Dhamma inside us by contemplating the teachings, depending on the teachings. That's another aspect of Kalyanamitta. And then in practice, the Bhikkhu Sangha, some of their time and energy is spent on personal practice. Each individual bhikkhu will spend some time doing his own personal practice, say alone in more isolated situations. But the fruits of his practice he'll bring back and teach the laity, share it with the laity. And that some bhikkhus will go off or go into a situation where they're more alone and then come back and teach. Others will teach and then go off. And it's sort of, there are these two aspects to the practice which go together. An example is one time Ajahn Chahs in the early days. They're going to build a big meditation hall, and they were preparing the building materials, preparing the wood, the planks and things. But in the process of it, the monks were doing it, most of the work themselves. He got really fed up with building. He just felt building, a lot of energy. He wasn't very inspired with it, I guess. So he went off, sort of sneaked away off to do some meditation, get some time alone away from the monastery, from all the building. And in later years, and then after that he came back obviously and carried on. But in later years he said if he hadn't gone off that time, he might not have understood the Dhamma as much as he might have. In other words, he was saying that going off in that time he probably practiced very well when he went off alone. But he came back and he shared the Dhamma that he gained from that period alone with everybody. And he said if he hadn't gone off alone that time, maybe there wouldn't be so many branch monasteries as there are today. Meaning that perhaps it was the periods he spent alone, practicing alone, is when he really learned to understand the Dhamma. He came back, shared that Dhamma with people, and then they in turn went off, practiced, and the fruits of their practice meant that other monks went off, set up monasteries and so on. He was implying that it's an important part of the practice to have time. Each individual has to have some time on their own for their own practice before they teach. Does it answer your question? Did you have a question, Michael?
I guess my question was perhaps in a similar sort of direction. Living here in Melbourne,
no cremation grounds.
Then it's a long way from Tatanga Bhikkhu practice. And even in Melbourne, it's a very simple, as a layperson, we moderate our lives a little. So some people in Melbourne would still see our lives as being extreme, given that the opportunity for excess in this society is quite great. So I was just wondering what Bhante would like to say about the translation of that sort of lifestyle, those sort of insights into the practice the blind people in society?
The main benefit of hearing about the lives of different teachers and how they practiced, even though the external conditions here are perhaps different from the forests of northeast Thailand, the important thing is to take them as examples, see them as examples of people who have had endurance, particularly patience and endurance, to work with their own minds to continue the practice. It wasn't all sort of smooth, constant, say, success for all these different teachers. They all had to go through periods where meditation was difficult. They had different problems, but that he's relating these stories is to help give you some encouragement to push through the various problems you have in practice and to keep at it. And you need some endurance for that, because there's obviously going to be periods when, say, if you're at home, you don't feel, some days you might feel you don't really want to come out, say, to hear this centre, Buddha Loka Centre, to meditate, but to try and, when you do feel lazy or depressed, or to try and rouse yourself, maybe you can think of these various teachers, the Buddha, all these teachers who have pushed through their various difficulties. You can use them for inspiration to get up a bit of energy to push through your own difficulties. He says he's very impressed with your dedication to practice, and what you should do is just to continue building on every little, build on these foundations with every little bit of effort you have, just to keep developing your meditation. If you keep doing it regularly and consistently, you will be rewarded.
In Thailand nowadays, do they still live the bodies in the open?
Although most of the dead are cremated, but in northeast Thailand particularly, it's still the tradition in some places. If somebody's died, say in a motor accident, or has been murdered, they won't burn them. They'll bury them, but often before they bury them, they'll just leave them out, or even sometimes they'll just bury them very light, with a very small amount of earth on top. And so it's still possible to practice in a cremation ground in that situation where there is a corpse. Maybe you can actually see the corpse and can sit meditation in front of it. There's a monastery, actually, he didn't say this, but I'll just add it as in addition, there's a monastery, one of our branch monasteries, where the abbot, you might have heard of him, Ajahn. He's now disrobed now, but he's an Australian, and he was the abbot of a monastery for about 8 years, I think. He's a very big forest, and occasionally when villagers from the surrounding villages died in such circumstances, there was one guy who was killed, who was shot. Another, I think, died from some disease. But anyway, the villagers brought the bodies into the monastery, into a designated area. It's a very big forest, but they set aside a part of the forest, and they put the bodies, just left them in an open kind of pit. They dug a shallow pit and put the bodies there, but they didn't cover them over. And then many different monks had the chance to practice meditation, maybe even set up their mosquito nets right next to the body for several days at a time, and they could live and just watch the body as it decomposed. I myself was doing that the night Ajahn died. I was next to one of these corpses, just sort of, it was like just left as a skeleton. It started off as a sort of somebody who died a few days, and over the period of a few weeks, few months, just the flesh sort of dried and disappeared, and there's just a skeleton left.
They don't use coffin at all?
Coffins? No, just simple wooden coffins. If they burn someone, this is in the villages, not in the towns, but in the villages they'll use just a simple wooden coffin and burn it. Or if it's somebody who they bury, that maybe they don't even use a coffin, they just put them straight in the ground or on the ground even. Still very simple in some places.
Once the Indian body was kept, how many days after the body was kept there that you started contemplating on the body?
That one, I imagine it had been there a few weeks, but that's because I came along afterwards. But some of the bodies, just within a few days, monks, I had the chance to go and contemplate when they were still like sort of moist, to have worms in them.
So when you meditate, when you contemplate, do you actually watch or just close your eyes and still? What's the situation?
Fairly simple, just to contemplate the impermanence of the body. Looking at a dead body, or a place, say, where if it's buried, there's usually a strong smell. But just to contemplate the impermanence of that body and the impermanence of your own body, comparing, and because you're with a dead body, it has all that more stronger impression on the mind. But the contemplation itself is very simple. The tradition is that if somebody dies through what you could say is natural causes, say through disease or old age, then they'll keep the body at the house for a certain number of days, 3 days, 7 days, and there'll be monks come and chant. But if somebody dies in an accident or is murdered, the feeling is that they've died before their time is up, so to speak. They've died quicker than usual, and there's a sense of being something unfortunate, bad luck, and so they'll quickly take the body away to the cremation ground and bury it as quickly as possible, rather than keeping it in the house. It's sort of this feeling that they'd rather not have bring bad luck into the house. I think the answer is any object which makes the mind peaceful in such a situation is okay. There's no set thing, sort of, you should contemplate impermanence, or you should do mindfulness of the breathing. Whatever works. The important thing to see is that in such a place where you have strong fear coming up, it makes you very mindful. You're sort of, every sound, every little tremor, your mind is right there, and that's why it's very good for meditation, because it makes you very mindful, and you see very easily that if you let your mind stray and start proliferating, thinking about what you're afraid of, very quickly you get caught up in the fear, and you're imagining shapes and things in the shadows, all sorts of things. And that's why it's good for meditation. You see, if you cut off the thought proliferation, then you can cut through the fear very quickly. And so whatever you can use, whatever meditation object works in that situation, that's what you should use.
they do come and disturb you when you sit there. And so sitting in that kind of environment, I'm sure it's good. Another process.
Says one time in his third rains, he was in a cremation ground meditating, and a young schoolgirl was on her way to school, had to use a boat to cross some water on her way to school, and the boat capsized and she died, she drowned. And then they came and buried her because she died in that way. They buried her in the cremation ground, and so he was meditating right next to her grave. And then one afternoon, as he was there, some people turned up with some soft drinks for him, and he was surprised that he didn't, that they knew he was there. And so that he asked them, "Why? How did you know I was here? You brought these soft drinks to offer. How did you know I was here meditating?" And they said, "Last night the ghost of the girl came and told us." And that just made him even more afraid, because then he realised the ghost was hanging around right next to him. He says your perceptions of things and your defilements are all become very extreme when you're in a situation like that. If you're in a cremation ground and very frightened, he said, like, this morning we went to the botanical gardens, and very beautiful, very impressed with how beautiful it was laid out, very nice trees, big trees. But if you're in a cremation ground, then every big tree becomes really frightening, total opposite. I mean, just the same big trees, but they suddenly become very frightening. And in Thailand you get there's a lot of insects there, and in the middle of the night you get these cicadas and different insects make this buzzing sound, and that becomes very, very frightening. And at the same time, anything that's kind of that you can cling to as a friend, you cling to any object as a friend. So, like as you're saying, Ajahn, you would cling to his bowl as a friend when he was in that situation. Ajahn Anan said when he was in the cremation ground, there'd be the sound of the wake-up bell in the local monastery. It'd be a long way off, but he'd just hear the sound of the bell at 3 a.m, and that would be like a friend coming to help him, because the mind is just in such a kind of unstable state. If you let your proliferating mind run away, then you just see ghosts in every shadow, and sort of everything becomes really frightening. So all this proliferation and all the trouble comes from the fact that we attach to the sense of self. If there's a sense of self, if there's a me, then there are ghosts, there's all sorts of nasty things out there that can come and hurt me, this me that you're attached to. At the same time, if you contemplate and see non-self, anatta, you're not attached to your body and your mind, you're not attached to this sense of self, then at the same time all the things outside, external things which can come and harm the sense of self, they all disintegrate and disappear at the same time. So the place you have to practice is within your own understanding, and if you can let go of the sense of self, then all the fear will go.
So this is sort of a revising idea, but not so common here, but perhaps more common is that fears that people sort of sending evil forces to possess you, and these can become quite overpowering in some people. I just wonder what John is saying, ways to do it.
The way to do that, to deal with that, is to meditate, make your mind as peaceful as you can in your meditation, and then kind of imagine or determine all your psychic energy, or the peaceful energy you've generated in your meditation to make a kind of force field around your body. Just to think, all my good energy here, good vibes, are protecting me from any evil or unpleasant forces. You could contemplate one of the 32 parts of the body and do the same thing. Just contemplate, just use one of the 32 parts as a meditation object to calm the mind. And that sense of calmness that arises just contemplating that one of the parts of the body, again use that as a kind of force field to protect yourself. Say, may the power of the Dhamma, the calm mind that sees the Dhamma, protect me from any evil forces.
If we practice and observe the 5 precepts, that is one way of protecting yourself as well as protecting the other beings as well within.
It does on one level. It's the keeping of the 5 precepts is a protection, but to be a more proficient or more complete protection, it should be combined with the practice of meditation. One makes one's mind firmer through meditation, and then the keeping of the 5 precepts becomes firmer.